I ended up looking backwards to where we were 6 million years ago, because this looping of male sexuality through the amygdala didn't happen recently, and it doesn't seem to be unique to humans. It's been this way for a long time, for a lot of species. And where we were 6 million years ago was a sexually dimorphic tournament species whose social organization is probably fairly analogous to that of modern chimpanzees. And here's the thing. Most, perhaps all, arguably, of our hardwired emotions, all those instincts, anything we're programmed to think or feel as a default, pretty much all of that is about sex and reproduction. It's either about getting sex and reproducing, optimizing sex and reproducing, living long enough to have sex and reproduce, or facilitating our kin's ability to have and or optimize sex and reproduce. Even our fight or flight instincts ultimately serve this purpose and can be systematically overridden if they get in the way of reproductive success, as those male praying mantises and their evolved tolerance of being eaten by their mates aptly demonstrate. We're conditioned to believe that there are all kinds of other things motivating us to a greater degree: ethics, morality, culture, goodwill, even mere survival. But consider for a moment that hunger is a survival mechanism that keeps people alive long after they're any use to anyone, but it wouldn't exist as an instinct hardwired into us if it had had no positive impact on who got to pass on copies of genes and who didn't. Hunger, thirst, fight or flight, fear, aggression, ambition, competition. In sexually reproductive species, every single one of these emotions, instincts, and behavioral propensities exist because they helped someone pass on their genes. They are, in essence, the products of who had sex and who did not. It's only when I extrapolated the importance of sex and reproductive onto all aspects of human behavior that I could see what was right in front of my face. Male sexuality is wired through the amygdala not because men are or must be more sexually aggressive with women than women are with men. It's because male-male aggression is what gets a man access to sex. And no, this doesn't mean that all men are violent with other men, or that they have to duke it out and in the octagon to obtain access to sex with hot ring babes, or that all of a man's life is an epic rap battle of history, nor does it mean that female dominance hierarchies don't exist. They absolutely do. But here's the thing. Female dominance hierarchies are not about access to sex. In sexually dimorphic species, harem species like those proto-chimpanzee/humans that used to be us, females always have access to sex. Consider the mountain gorilla, one of our closest relatives, where virtually all the females reproduce, but only 5% of the males do. Consider chimps, where all the females reproduce, while less than 20% of the males do. Consider even the promiscuous bonobo, where about half to 3/4 of the males reproduce, even though they all have access to sex, because the most socially dominant males sire the majority due to females favoring them during estrus, while virtually all the females reproduce. 6 million years ago among our ancestors, a lot further back than that, in fact, I'm almost positive, the primary factor determining whether a male would reproduce or not was his willingness to compete with other males in a male dominance hierarchy. And it probably wasn't much fun, even when battles were ritualized. Getting your ass kicked sucks, and willingly and repeatedly subjecting yourself to potential ass kickings requires deprioritizing all kinds of other instincts and propensities. Fear, anxiety, injury avoidance, indolence, energy conservation, even survival. In other words, you need some serious motivation in order to assert yourself in the battle for male dominance that is the prerequisite for access to sexual opportunities for any tournament male. Now, us humans have been veering away from the tournament model for about 6 million years, and human males in the modern West no longer compete in any of those visceral, brutal ways, because the modern environment has transformed the criteria for obtaining and maintaining status in the male dominance hierarchy. The more primitive forms of competition are now the ones that are considered ritualized violence, while the real game plays out in boardrooms and on legislative floors, in the media, the labor force, the military, education and academia, in schoolyards and the economy, the nightclub, the white ribbon campaign, and in thousands of subtle displays of male social one-upmanship. We've actually come to see the real thing, physical aggression and potentially deadly violence, as a ritualization complete with rules, referees, and big shiny belts. And the more civilized and ritualized forms, social posturing, braggadocio, machismo, insisting on picking up the check, getting that coveted contract, collecting letters after your name, use of the word esquire, career success, holding forth, being in a band, getting that promotion, becoming president, being the go-to guy to score someone some weed, white knighting, bad-mouthing, and a host of other ways men can say, I'm better than that guy, as something other than male aggression. But aggression is exactly what it is. As Mr. 1001 Nights recently said, men are willing to believe another man is a rapist because it's a way of undermining that other man's status relative to one's own. And nothing undermines a guy's status like being seen as a rapist. A rapist harms women, which is a cultural and biological taboo. And he's also a man who is so pathetic he can't convince a woman to willingly lie down with him. Now if, according to a man's instincts, to his lowest levels of wetware, every woman on earth represents a potential means of getting his genes into the pool, then to all those same instincts, every unrelated or unaffiliated male on earth is a potential rival or competitor in the quest for his own reproductive success, someone he must one-up, aspire to equal, surpass, gain respect from, or throw under the bus if there is status to be gained by doing so. Now, if I'm correct in my speculation that it is the male sex drive that fuels male-male aggression within male dominance hierarchies, rather than aggression fueling men's sex drives, then Jordan Peterson is right. Men do derive their confidence from dominance hierarchies, and this is something that isn't going to change anytime soon, because it was so important to men's reproductive success over millions of years that natural selection wired it into their brains. This also leads me to consider a few possible consequences of this, if it's the case. 1. Women may never perform equally to men at the upper reaches of those hierarchies because they lack the extra motivation men possess that compels them to override all those other instincts and propensities that discourage an individual from wholesale participation in an arena that can be so demanding. 2. The phenomenon of what some MRAs call female colonization of male-dominated spheres will continue to precipitate an accelerating departure of men from those spheres. First, there is no masculine status to be gained by vigorously competing against women, only status to be lost. If you beat her, you're an asshole. If she beats you, you're a pathetic loser. Second, it fails to evoke the male compulsion to throw down and put everything into competing against, another male. So they simply lose their taste to compete in that sphere and wander away, the way they largely have from, say, teaching or veterinary medicine or psychology. 3. As Dr. Catherine Hakim theorizes, once a sphere becomes female-dominated, it loses status, not because it is female-dominated, but because those within it are less likely to treat the field as the primary measure of their social status. According to Hakim, the British Medical Association recently expressed concern about this, saying that because women choose part-time work, etc., and do not put in the same time and effort into bargaining and trade union activities, so the relative pay and standing of doctors would decline slowly but surely. In Russia, where the majority of physicians are female, the pay and status of doctors is far lower than in the West. In other words, it's not the perception of women being lower status, but women's own reluctance to prioritize work above all else that leads those fields to become less prestigious and less well-paying. Women don't see their work as the most important thing, so when they come to dominate a field, other people see it the same way. And the most interesting thing is that competition on the female dominance hierarchy is largely a subconscious competition about overt sexual or mate value. Who can be the most beautiful, the most sexually attractive, the most able to afford to be selective when choosing partners? Women compete with each other sexually, but the goal, if evolution can be said to have one, is not to obtain sex. Remember, in a tournament system, females always have access to sex. The trappings of the competition are all about sex appeal, but the purpose of the competition is to gain status and power through the perception of high mate value. Men compete with each other within a power hierarchy, sometimes with violence, but the goal is not to obtain power or status. It's to obtain sexual opportunities through the attainment of status and power. Like Anne Althouse speculated, Men seek power to gain access to sex, and women use sex to gain access to power. This does not mean that men who seek power, or who are high achievers, are consciously looking to get laid. Some noted male high achievers, such as Nikola Tesla, had little to no interest in sex at all. But that doesn't mean their sexual wiring didn't amplify their drive to achieve. One could even see those men as having taken the boxer's wisdom of abstaining from sex the night before the big fight to its extreme. As I've said before, evolution doesn't have a purpose or a goal. It's a process of accidentally stumbling on things that work better than the last thing. It's altogether possible that this particular quirk of male wiring occurred as a mutation millions upon millions of years ago and spread through the population simply because the males who had it were competitive with other males and those who didn't were not. If the very first male animal whose neurons were wired this way was wildly more successful than all the others, it's conceivable that an entire model of social organization, the tournament system, would have grown out of that one mutation. This is low-level wetware, and regardless of how many layers of new adaptations we've built on top of it, it remains a fundamental difference in the brains and sexualities of men and women, one that cannot help but have an impact on their motivations and behaviors. The only real question is what motivations does it produce, and what behaviors result from them. The more I examine it in the context of the increasingly gender-symmetrical data on sexual aggression in men and women, and the different styles and outcomes of same-sex competition in men and women, the more I'm inclined to believe that this particular quirk is not about male sexual aggression against women, but about motivating men to compete with other men in dominance hierarchies. Well, I suppose that isn't the only question. Another question might be this. If men have an innate drive to seek power because power is what gets men access to sexual opportunities, while women use their sexuality to gain access to power, which sex is the truly power-hungry one?